If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Paul Winters, though most folks around here just call me Ice. This happened to me back in '67, and even now, after all these years, my hands shake when I tell this story. I've been a ranger at White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire for nearly 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at me. Boy, was I wrong. I am what they call an Arctic survival expert. Spent 15 years teaching people how to stay alive in the coldest places on Earth. The locals trusted me because I knew every trail, every cave, and every dangerous spot in these mountains like the back of my hand. When things got rough in winter, I was usually the guy they called. That winter of '67 started like any other. I was 48 then, still strong, still confident. My little ranger station sat near Crawford Notch, surrounded by tall pines that looked like Christmas cards when it snowed. I had my routine, morning radio checks, patrol routes, and helping lost hikers find their way back to safety. But then, everything changed. The weather report started showing something big coming our way. Not just your regular New Hampshire winter storm, but something that made even my experienced bones feel uneasy. The old-timers in town were nervous too, especially Joe, an Abenaki elder who'd been my friend for years. He kept muttering about something called the Kiwakwu, a winter spirit his people had known about for generations. I remember checking my thermometer that first morning when it all began. The mercury had dropped to -50 due 4F, breaking records older than my grandfather. Something felt different about this cold. It wasn't natural. And that's when I saw the first signs that this wasn't going to be any ordinary winter in the White Mountains. It started with a call about 7 missing backpackers. Nothing too unusual for this time of year, except something felt off right from the start. As I geared up to go look for them, I noticed something strange on the trees outside my station. Weird ice crystals growing upward, against gravity. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years in the mountains. The wind was howling that day, making the -50 degrees feel even colder. My breath froze instantly in my beard as I followed the backpackers' last known trail. That's when I found the first really scary thing, a moose, completely frozen solid. Now, I've seen frozen animals before, but this was different. When I checked closer, though everything in me said not to, its insides looked like crystal, like something had frozen it from the inside out. I tried radioing back to base, but all I got was this awful sound, like ice cracking deep in a lake. My compass wasn't working either. The needle just shook and then broke apart, something I'd never seen in my life. Then I found their campsite. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. Coffee cups still full, food on plates, like they'd all just vanished in the middle of breakfast. The weird part? The food wasn't just frozen. It looked like it had turned to ice while they were eating it. Their tents were covered in that same strange ice I'd seen on the trees. But the footprints I found, those really got to me. They were huge, about 16 inches long, and the edges looked like crystal. They weren't made by any animal I knew, and I knew them all. As the sun started setting, the temperature dropped even more. Not gradually like normal, but sudden, like someone had opened a giant freezer door. I could feel something watching me from the woods, something that didn't want to be found. That's when old Joe's warning about the Kiwakwu started making a lot more sense. Maybe those old stories weren't just stories after all. Something was out there in my mountains, something that shouldn't exist, and I had a feeling I was about to find out exactly what it was. The radio crackled again, this time with a voice that sounded like breaking ice. Help? They're turning. Then nothing but static. That night at the ranger station, everything changed. The blizzard hit harder than anything I'd ever seen, and that's when I first saw it. I was looking out my window when the snow suddenly stopped, just stopped in midair. Through the swirling white, I saw something that still haunts my dreams. It was like a person, but enormous, maybe 15 feet tall. But it wasn't really a person at all. Its body was made of clear ice, and inside, I could see a storm swirling around, like it had trapped a blizzard in its chest. Wherever it walked, everything froze solid. The thermometer by my window dropped so fast it broke, and the windows started crackling with ice. Then came the worst part. Mike, one of our newer rangers, was outside checking the generator. I tried to shout a warning, but it was too late. The ice creature, this thing, just reached out, and Mike kind of dissolved into it, like he was being pulled into the swirling snow inside its body. I watched helpless as an exact copy of Mike formed next to the creature, but made entirely of ice. This ice copy of Mike looked just like him, but moved all wrong. It turned its head toward me, and its eyes, they were empty, like frozen pools. I knew right then that whatever was wearing Mike's shape wasn't Mike anymore. I locked myself in the radio room, trying to call for help. But every time I got close to making contact, the temperature would drop even more, and the radio would freeze up. Through the window, I could see more of these ice copies appearing in the forest, all looking like the missing backpackers. The creature, this frost walker, as I started calling it, it seemed to be able to control the storm itself. Whenever it raised its arms, the blizzard would get worse. It created this wall of ice around our whole sector, trapping us inside its frozen territory. By morning, the temperature had dropped to minus 80 degrees. My thermometer couldn't even measure that low, but the military equipment we had in storage could. Everything metal was brittle and breaking, and the air itself felt wrong, like it was turning solid. I knew I had to do something. 7 missing hikers, 1 missing ranger, and now these ice copies walking around. This wasn't just a search and rescue mission anymore. This was something else entirely, something none of my training had prepared me for. Want to hear what I discovered when I started digging into the history of these mountains? I spent the next few days digging through old files in the ranger station's basement, trying to make sense of what was happening. What I found made my blood run cold. Every 30 years, like clockwork since 1847, similar things had happened in these mountains. People disappearing, strange ice formations, and temperatures dropping to impossible levels. I found an old journal from a ranger who worked here in the 1930s. His hands must have been shaking when he wrote it because the writing was all over the place. He described seeing the exact same thing I saw. The ice creature, the copies of people, everything. But here is the really strange part. At the end of his journal, there were official government papers ordering him to never speak about what he saw. The more I dug, the darker it got. In 1947, the military had tried to capture this thing. They sent in a whole unit of soldiers. Not one of them came back. All they found were perfect ice statues of the men, standing like they were frozen mid-step. Old Joe helped me find something else too. Ancient cave paintings hidden deep in the mountains. They showed the same tall ice figure I'd seen, and according to Joe's translations, his people had been watching for this thing for hundreds of years. They called it the winter spirit cycle, and it always came with the full moon. I was still reading through these files when my radio suddenly crackled to life. It was a military frequency, one we weren't supposed to know about. They were coming, they said. A special unit that dealt with things like this. But something in their voice told me they weren't telling me everything. That's when I found it, a hidden door in the ranger station's basement. It led to an underground room filled with strange equipment and more files. This wasn't just about a monster in the woods anymore. This was something bigger, something the government had been tracking for decades. The last ranger who disappeared? Turns out he wasn't just a ranger. He was working for some secret government program, trying to study this thing. But from what I could piece together, they didn't just want to study it. They wanted to control it. As I was reading all this, the temperature started dropping again. The lights flickered, and I could hear that sound, like cracking ice coming from above. Something was about to happen. Something big. Things went from bad to worse real fast. A search and rescue helicopter came to help us, but as soon as it got close to the mountain, it just froze. The whole thing turned to ice mid-air and crashed. When we found the crew, they were like ice statues, frozen with looks of terror on their faces. 3 more of my ranger friends, Tom, Sarah, and Dave, they got caught by the ice creature while trying to help some stranded hikers. I watched helplessly as they transformed, their skin turning crystal clear, their eyes becoming hollow and white. They joined the other ice copies, wandering through the forest like frozen ghosts. The military team finally arrived in their big trucks and heavy equipment. They thought they were ready for anything, but they weren't ready for this. I tried to warn them, but they wouldn't listen. They went in with their fancy weapons and protective gear, but the creature just walked right through them. The cold was so intense it made their guns shatter like glass. That's when we discovered something underneath all that ice. While running from the creature, we fell into an old cave system. Inside, we found stone circles and ancient carvings. This wasn't just some random monster. This thing was a guardian, protecting something much older and more dangerous. The military commander finally told me the truth. Back in the 1940s, they'd found a kind of doorway deep in these mountains, a portal to somewhere else. They built a secret facility to study it, but they didn't understand what they were messing with. The creature wasn't just killing people, it was protecting this portal, keeping something much worse from coming through. I could see the ice copies gathering outside the cave entrance, more and more of them. They moved together now, like a frozen army. The temperature kept dropping lower and lower, and strange lights started appearing in the sky. Whatever was coming, it was going to happen soon. The military was talking about bringing in a nuclear weapon to clean up the situation. But I knew that would only make things worse. This wasn't something we could fight with weapons. There had to be another way. The final night was something I'll never forget. I remembered what old Joe had told me about the ancient rituals, and I knew what I had to do. I grabbed some sacred objects from the cave, an old stone pendant and some carved symbols, and headed deeper into the mountain. The blizzard was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The snow wasn't falling down anymore, it was swirling in all directions, like the whole world had gone crazy. The ice creature was there, waiting for me in a massive cave I'd never known existed. It was like it knew I was coming. The military was getting ready to launch their attack, but I had to stop them. This creature, this guardian, it wasn't evil, it was scared. For hundreds of years, it had been protecting that portal alone, keeping our world safe from whatever was on the other side. But it was weakening, and it needed help. That's when everything started happening at once. The ground shook. Ice crystals shot up from the earth like giant spears, and time itself felt wrong, like some moments were going too fast and others too slow. The ice copies of all the people it had taken were gathering around us, their frozen faces watching. I looked into the creature's swirling storm center, and suddenly I understood. It needed a new guardian, someone who knew the mountains, someone who could handle the cold, someone who understood what had to be done. It had been watching me all along, testing me. I took the stone pendant and started reciting the ancient words old Joe had taught me. The creature reached out, but this time I didn't run. As its icy hand touched me, I felt the cold seep into my bones. But it didn't hurt anymore. It felt right. I could feel myself changing, becoming part of the winter itself. The last thing I saw as a normal human was the military retreating, the ice copies melting away, and the storm calming down. I had become what the mountain needed, a new guardian. That was the last time anyone saw Paul Winters, the ranger. But if you go to White Mountain National Forest on a full moon, you might see strange ice formations growing up the trees. The locals leave small offerings, little bundles of herbs and crystals, near certain caves. They say it keeps the winter spirit happy. The military still watches the mountain, but they keep their distance now. They know better than to interfere again. As for me, well, I am still here, protecting these mountains and the secrets they hold. I am not exactly human anymore, but I am not completely gone either. Sometimes, on very cold nights, Hikers say they see a tall figure made of ice walking through the trees. They say if you look carefully, you can see a storm swirling inside it, and maybe, just maybe, the face of an old ranger who loved these mountains enough to become their eternal guardian. But that's just a story they tell around here, isn't it? My name is Maria Blackhawk, and this is my story from 1988. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but what happened in those dark caves of New Mexico changed my life forever. I was 41 back then, working as a cave rescue specialist at Carlsbad Caverns. After serving as a combat medic in the military, I thought I'd seen it all, but boy was I wrong. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the ground started shaking. Not just any regular tremor, we're talking about a serious 6.2 earthquake that rocked our whole world. Little did I know, this wasn't just another day at work. This earthquake would unveil something that should have stayed hidden forever. I remember sitting in my office, sipping my morning coffee, when the emergency calls started pouring in. 3 spelunkers had gone missing in a newly opened section of the cave. Now, people getting lost in caves isn't unusual in my line of work, but something felt different this time. The reports coming in were strange, to say the least. My team reported weird crystal formations that seemed to hum, not like anything we'd seen before. And the heat readings? They were off the charts, showing temperatures that shouldn't exist 700 feet underground. But what really got to me were the ancient Pueblo drawings we found near the entrance. They showed these eerie warnings about those below. I'd grown up hearing my grandmother's stories about cave spirits, but I'd always thought they were just tales to keep kids from wandering too far. I should have listened to those warnings. I should have paid more attention to my grandmother's stories. But I was a woman of science, trained to trust facts over folklore. As I gathered my rescue team and prepared to head down into that darkness, I had no idea we were about to uncover something that would challenge everything I believed in. Leading my 4-person team into the cave, I noticed something wasn't right from the start. Our equipment started acting weird, compasses spinning like crazy, and our radios making these awful screeching sounds instead of normal static. "Hey Maria, come, look at this," called Tom, our geology expert. He was shining his flashlight on something unusual. There, perfectly preserved in a small alcove, was a body. Not just any body. It looked centuries old, but it was preserved as if the person had died yesterday. The strange thing was, their face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. "Everyone stay close," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. But that's when things got even weirder. Jake, our youngest team member, swore he saw the mineral formations on the walls move when he wasn't looking directly at them. I thought he was just scared until I saw it too. These strange, crystalline structures that seemed to shift position every time we turned away. "What time is it?" Sarah suddenly asked, her voice shaking. We all checked our watches. Somehow, 2 hours had vanished. We'd been in the cave for what felt like 30 minutes, but our watches showed we'd been down there for nearly 3 hours. The worst part? None of us could remember what we'd been doing during that lost time. The air was getting warmer, much warmer than it should be this deep underground. Our flashlight beams caught something glinting in the darkness ahead. More of those strange crystal formations. But these ones were pulsing, like they were alive. "Maria," Tom whispered, pointing his trembling finger toward a dark corner. "Tell me you see that too." I turned my flashlight where he was pointing, and my blood ran cold. There, etched into the cave wall, were fresh claw marks, huge ones, like nothing I'd ever seen before. And they were still warm to the touch. That's when we heard it, a deep, low humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like any cave sound I'd heard in my 15 years of rescue work. It sounded intelligent. "We need to find those missing spelunkers and get out of here," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Something's very wrong in this cave. Little did I know, we were about to discover exactly how wrong things were going to get. The next few hours changed everything we knew about what lived beneath our feet. We were following a trail that might lead us to the missing spelunkers when Sarah screamed. At first, I thought she'd just slipped. That happens a lot in caves. But what we saw next, I still have nightmares about it. Standing there, partly hidden in the shadows, was something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, maybe 7 feet or more, and looked almost human, but not quite. Its skin, if you could call it that, looked like the cave walls themselves, like living rock. And though it didn't have any eyes we could see, I knew it was watching us. "Nobody move," I whispered, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But before anyone could react, Tom let out a gasp. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and in a movement that seemed impossible, it just melded into the cave wall, like water soaking into sand. Did everyone just see that? Jake's voice was barely a whisper. We huddled together, our flashlights darting everywhere. That's when we noticed more of them. They were all around us, moving through the rock like it was water. We could hear them making these low, humming sounds. They were talking to each other. Suddenly, Sarah screamed again. "Tom! Where's Tom?" He had been right next to us just seconds ago. Now he was gone. No sound, no struggle, just gone. And Jake. Jake was next. 1 minute he was clutching my arm. The next, empty space. I grabbed Sarah's hand. "Run!" I yelled. We sprinted through the tunnels, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly off the walls. The humming got louder, and the air felt thick and hot. Behind us, we could hear something moving through the rock, getting closer and closer. We turned a corner and found ourselves in a massive chamber. What we saw there made us stop dead in our tracks. The walls were covered in what looked like a city, an ancient city built right into the rock. And scattered around were bones, hundreds of bones, some looking centuries old, others fresher. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened. "Maria," she whispered, "what are we going to do?" Before I could answer, our radios crackled to life. Through the static, we heard something that gave me a tiny spark of hope. "This is Special Forces Unit Delta. Anyone down there, respond immediately." The military was coming, but as I looked at the ancient city around us and heard the creatures getting closer, I wondered if even they could help us now. The military's arrival should have made me feel safer, but something about them seemed off. They were too prepared, like they knew exactly what they were walking into. Their leader, Colonel Richards, pulled me aside while his team set up their equipment. "Ranger Blackhawk," he said quietly, "what you found here isn't new to us. We've known about these things since 1947. My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? You knew these creatures existed?" Before he could answer, one of his soldiers called out, "Sir, we've got movement." The chamber filled with soldiers, their special weapons aimed at the walls. That's when I noticed Sarah was gone, just disappeared, like Tom and Jake. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The creatures were getting bolder. They weren't hiding anymore. I watched in horror as one of them reached through the solid rock wall and grabbed a soldier. His scream was cut short as he was pulled into the wall like it was quicksand. "Fall back," Colonel Richards shouted. "Get to the main chamber." As we ran, he explained between breaths. "In 47, we found their city, tried to study them. Big mistake. They can. They can change people, turn them into something else." We reached a massive underground room filled with military equipment. On their screens, I could see heat signatures everywhere, in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. We were surrounded. "Look!" Someone pointed at the far wall. There, half merged with the rock, was Jake. But it wasn't really Jake anymore. His skin had started to look like stone, and his eyes were gone. "Maria," he called out in a voice that wasn't quite human anymore. "They want to show us something important." The humming got louder, and the ground started to shake. The creatures were herding us deeper into their domain, towards something they wanted us to see. Colonel Richards looked at me with fear in his eyes. "We've got no choice," he said. "We have to go deeper. But first," he handed me a small device with a red button. "If things go wrong, if we can't stop what's coming, this will trigger explosives we've planted throughout the cave system. It's our last resort." I took the device, hoping I'd never have to use it. As we moved deeper into the cave, I couldn't help but wonder, what were these creatures really after? And why did they want us to see what was below? The answers were waiting for us, but I had a feeling we weren't going to like what we found. What we found in the depths of that cave still haunts me. After walking for what felt like hours, we entered a chamber so huge our flashlights couldn't reach the ceiling. But it wasn't the size that made us gasp. It was what was inside. A whole city stretched out before us, but not like any city you've ever seen. The buildings twisted in ways that hurt your eyes to look at them, and everything seemed to pulse with a faint red light. Worst of all, there was this massive machine in the center, made of living rock and, I can barely say it, human bones. "My God," Colonel Richards whispered. "It's bigger than the reports said." That's when we heard Sarah's voice echoing from somewhere in the darkness. "Maria, help me!" I started running toward her voice, but the colonel grabbed my arm. "Wait, it might be a trap." He was right. What stepped out of the shadows wasn't Sarah, not anymore. Her skin had turned gray like stone, and her movements were all wrong, like a puppet on strings. Behind her, more figures emerged. Tom, Jake, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. All of them changed, all of them wrong. "They need us, not," Sarah said in a voice that echoed strangely. "They've been waiting so long. The Queen wants to meet you, Maria." The ground trembled, and a section of the wall opened up. Through it, I could see the biggest chamber yet. And in the center, I've never seen anything like it. The Queen was enormous, like a mountain made of crystal and stone. Around her were these pods, hundreds of them. Inside each one was a person, slowly changing into something else. "This is what they've been doing," Colonel Richards said, his voice shaking. "They're not just taking people, they're turning them into more of themselves. And now they want to come to the surface." The humming got louder, and suddenly my head was filled with images, visions of these creatures spreading across the world, changing everyone, turning Earth into something alien and wrong. I felt the detonator in my pocket grow heavy. I could end this right now, seal them away forever. But what about the people they'd taken? What about Sarah, Tom, and Jake? The Queen moved closer, and I heard her voice in my head. "Choose, Maria Blackhawk. Join us, or end us all." I looked at the detonator in my hand. Whatever I decided next would change everything. My hand trembled on the detonator as memories of my grandmother's words flooded back. She used to say, "Sometimes the hardest choice is the only right one." Looking at what used to be my friends, at the Queen, at all those innocent people in the pods, I knew what I had to do. "I am so sorry," I whispered, pressing the red button. Nothing happened. The Queen made a sound that might have been laughter. "Your explosives cannot harm us," her voice echoed in my head. But then I noticed Colonel Richards smiling. "Those weren't the real explosives," he said, pulling out another device. "This is." Everything happened at once. The Colonel threw me a small ancient stone, something with Pueblo markings on it. "Your grandmother left this with us years ago," he shouted. "She said only someone of the bloodline could use it." Suddenly, I understood. The petroglyphs at the entrance, my grandmother's stories, they weren't just warnings, they were instructions. The stone grew warm in my hand as I held it up. The Queen shrieked, a horrible sound that shook the whole cave. "Now!" Colonel Richards yelled, hitting his detonator. The explosions started, but they weren't just destroying things. They were sealing the creatures in, trapping them in their own stone. I held the stone higher, speaking the words my grandmother had taught me as a child, words I never thought meant anything real. The Queen lunged at me, but it was too late. A blinding light filled the chamber. I saw Sarah, Tom, and Jake's bodies fall to the ground, the creature's influence leaving them. The stone walls started closing in, sealing the Queen and her kind away forever. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Sarah's unconscious body while soldiers grabbed the others. We raced through the collapsing tunnels, the sound of the Queen's fury chasing us all the way up. We barely made it out. Behind us, the entrance sealed itself, trapping those things deep underground where they belonged. The survivors, the ones we could save, were rushed to hospitals. Many didn't remember what happened to them, and maybe that's for the best. The military covered it all up, of course, said it was just a cave-in caused by the earthquake, but they didn't get everything. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear that humming coming from deep underground, and sometimes I see the missing persons reports in the local paper and wonder. Sarah, Tom, and Jake recovered, though they're never quite been the same. Neither have I. We don't talk about what happened down there, but we all know the truth. There are things living deep in the earth, ancient things, and that stone I used didn't destroy them. It just locked them away. For now. It's been years since that day in Carlsbad caverns. I still work here as a cave rescue specialist, but things are different now. The military keeps a permanent research station near the sealed entrance, though we all know they're really standing guard. Sarah, Tom, and Jake transferred to different parks. We meet once a year for coffee, not talking much about what happened, but understanding each other in a way nobody else can. Sometimes their hands shake when they hear certain sounds, and all of us avoid going too deep underground. The nightmares haven't stopped. I dream about the Queen, about those twisted buildings, and about the faces of the people we couldn't save. My grandmother's stone sits in a military vault somewhere, though sometimes I swear I can feel it calling to me. Last week, a small earthquake shook the area. Nothing big, just 2.3 on the scale. But that night, the local dogs wouldn't stop barking, and some people reported hearing a strange humming sound. I caught one of the military guards looking worried as he checked his instruments. The caves are sealed, but for how long? Those creatures waited centuries before. They can wait again. And sometimes, when I walk past the blocked entrance, I could swear I hear whispers in my head saying, "Soon, Maria Blackhawk. Soon." I keep the phone number for Colonel Richards on my speed dial, just in case. And every morning I check the local news for missing persons reports, hoping I won't recognize any patterns. Because deep down, I know the truth. We didn't defeat them. We just bought ourselves some time. And somewhere, deep beneath our feet, they're still waiting, still changing, still planning. They're patient. They have all the time in the world. And they remember my name. My name is John Martinez, but out here in Death Valley, they call me the Desert Ghost. This happened to me back in 1975, and even today, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the scorching heat and see those strange lights dancing across the dunes. I was 45 then, working as a park ranger in Death Valley National Park. After spending 15 years in Special Forces as a tracker, I thought I'd seen it all. But what happened during those 10 days under the blood moon proved me wrong. So very wrong. Let me start from the beginning. It was the hottest summer I'd ever experienced in my 12 years at Death Valley. The thermometer hit 135 DU4F, hot enough to fry an egg on the hood of my Jeep. And I am not kidding. I actually saw tourists try that. But the heat wasn't what worried me. It was the disappearances. 3 scientists had gone missing while studying some old Native American sites. Now, people getting lost in Death Valley isn't unusual. It's a harsh place that doesn't forgive mistakes. But something felt different this time. The Hopi elders I'd befriended over the years had been warning about something they called the sand spirits. At first, I brushed it off as old legends. I mean, I am half Native American myself, and I've heard plenty of stories growing up. But after what I saw in those 10 days, well, maybe our ancestors were trying to warn us all along. I remember that first morning like it happened yesterday. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and that's when the call came in. They'd found the first body, or what was left of it. What I saw that morning would change everything I thought I knew about our world, and about time itself. When I reached the spot where they found the first body, something wasn't right. The victim, one of the missing scientists, looked like a mummy, completely dried out. But here is the strange part. He'd only been missing for 2 days. Even in Death Valley's extreme heat, a body doesn't dry up that fast. As I knelt down to examine the scene, I noticed something else weird. The sand around the body had formed perfect circles and triangles, like someone had drawn them with a giant compass. But when I blinked, they were gone. Just smooth sand, as if those patterns had never been there. That night, while driving back to my station, I saw lights in the distance. At first, I thought they were just car headlights or maybe campers with flashlights. But these lights, they danced across the dunes like floating fireflies, moving in ways that didn't make sense. I radioed back to base, but they said there were no other vehicles in that area. Things got even stranger the next day. I was checking my watch regularly as I patrolled the area where we found the body. At one point, I looked at my watch and it showed 2:30 p.m. I drove for what felt like 15 minutes, but when I checked again, it was only 2:32 p.m. Later that same day, I could have sworn I patrolled a section for just 10 minutes, but my watch showed 2 hours had passed. While searching the area, I kept finding old artifacts just sitting on top of the sand. Pottery pieces, arrowheads, things that should have been buried under feet of sand. It was like the desert was digging up its own secrets. The radio crackled with another report. They'd found 2 more bodies in the same mummified condition. And this time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. As I approached the scene, I could have sworn I saw one of the victims walking across the dunes, but when I ran toward them, they disappeared like a mirage. That's when I knew whatever was happening in Death Valley wasn't natural, and it was only the beginning. On the 3rd day, I saw it for the first time. I was tracking footprints in the sand. That's what I do best, when a massive sandstorm appeared out of nowhere. But this wasn't any normal sandstorm. The sand, it moved like it was alive, forming shapes I can't even describe properly. One minute it looked like a giant human figure, the next like a coyote, then something else entirely. The temperature around me dropped suddenly, which is impossible in Death Valley's summer heat. My thermometer showed 75 dU4F, a 60-degree drop in seconds. That's when I realized I was dealing with something that broke all the rules of nature I knew. I tried to radio for help, but all I got was static and strange whispers that made no sense. Then I saw them, perfect copies of the missing scientists, walking through the desert. They looked so real, but when I got closer, they turned to sand and blew away in the wind. The worst part? Time started playing tricks on me again. I'd walk in one direction for 5 minutes and somehow end up back where I started. It was like being trapped in a loop, like when you are in a maze but can't find the way out. 2 more search teams went missing that day. We found their vehicles, engines still running, but the people? Gone. Just gone. And the sand around their cars had those same perfect geometric patterns I'd seen before. I've been in some scary situations in my life. Fought in wars, tracked dangerous criminals, but nothing compared to what I felt out there. It was like the desert itself was watching us, playing with us, maybe even hunting us. That night, while camping in my Jeep, no way I was sleeping in a tent, I saw the entity again. This time, it was closer. The sand swirled up into a tornado-like shape, but instead of moving away, it came right at me. As it got closer, I could see faces in the sand, faces of people who'd gone missing in Death Valley over the years. I grabbed my camera to take a picture, but when I checked later, all I got was a blank photo. That's when I knew I needed to dig deeper into Death Valley's history. Something told me these weren't just random events. There was a pattern here, going back way further than I'd imagined. I spent the next day digging through old files in the ranger station. What I found gave me chills. Every 30 years, during a blood moon eclipse, people had gone missing in Death Valley. Not just a few people, dozens. The reports went back centuries. I found old maps from Native American tribes showing burial grounds, but something was odd. All the burial sites formed a perfect circle around one central point. When I checked that spot on a modern map, it matched exactly where we'd been finding the mummified bodies. Then I discovered something even stranger, a folder marked Classified from 1952. Inside were photos of what looked like a secret government facility, right in the heart of Death Valley. The facility was studying something they called temporal anomalies, weird changes in time. But the whole place had been abandoned overnight. No explanation why. While I was reading, my radio suddenly came to life. Through the static, I heard screams. A new search party had found something, an entrance to what they described as an underground temple. But before they could tell me more, their radio went dead. When I got to their location, the scene was horrible. All 5 members of the search party were there, mummified like the others. But the way their bodies were arranged, they formed a perfect star pattern, pointing toward the temple entrance. The entrance itself looked ancient, with strange symbols carved into the stone. But here is the weird part. Mixed in with the old carvings were modern-looking metal panels, like someone had tried to contain whatever was down there. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, my watch started spinning backwards. The sun jumped across the sky like someone was fast-forwarding a movie. And in the distance, I saw more of those sand creatures forming, not just one this time, but 3, 4, maybe more. I knew I had to go into that temple. Whatever was causing all this, the answers were down there. But as I took my first step toward the entrance, I heard something that made me freeze, the sound of helicopter blades in the distance. The military was coming. The military helicopter never made it. As it got closer, one of those impossible sandstorms appeared out of nowhere. I watched helplessly as the chopper spun out of control and crashed. But when I ran to help, there was no wreckage, just more sand patterns and empty uniforms, like the people inside had just vanished. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. With my flashlight in one hand and my radio in the other, I entered the temple. The steps went down, down, down into the darkness. The air got colder with each step, which made no sense this deep in Death Valley. The walls were covered with 2 different kinds of writing, ancient tribal symbols and what looked like modern scientific formulas. As my flashlight beam moved across them, the symbols seemed to glow and shift, like they were alive. Then I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A huge round room with what looked like old computers, mixed with stone artifacts. In the center was a circle of metal and stone, like a giant ring standing upright. And scattered around it were more bodies, but these weren't recent. Some looked hundreds, maybe thousands of years old. My radio crackled to life, but instead of voices, I heard a high-pitched sound that made my head hurt. The ring in the center of the room started to hum. The sand on the floor began moving by itself, swirling into shapes. That's when I saw it. A calendar carved into the wall. It showed the cycles of the moon, and tomorrow night would be the blood moon eclipse. The same kind of eclipse that happened every time people disappeared in Death Valley. Suddenly, the ground started shaking. More sand creatures were forming in the room. Through the temple entrance, I could hear screaming from above. The whole desert was coming alive. I realized I wasn't just looking at some ancient temple. This was something much bigger. This was some kind of doorway, and tomorrow night, during the eclipse, it was going to open. The next night, as the blood moon began to rise, everything went crazy. The sand creatures, dozens of them now, were all heading toward the temple. The air itself felt wrong, like reality was coming apart at the seams. I watched from the temple entrance as time went completely wild. In one spot, I saw flowers grow and die in seconds. In another, I saw dinosaur footprints appear in the sand, then vanish. It was like all of time was happening at once. The ring in the temple started glowing bright red, matching the color of the blood moon above. That's when I finally understood what this place really was. It wasn't just a temple, it was some kind of ancient machine. The people who built it, whether they were Native Americans or someone even older, had found a way to control time itself. But something had gone wrong. The machine was broken, and every 30 years, during the blood moon, it tried to fix itself by taking people's life force. That's why everyone became mummified. The machine was literally draining their time away. I knew what I had to do. My grandmother, who was full-blooded Hopi, had given me an ancient medallion before she died. She said I'd know when to use it. The medallion had the same symbols as the ones on the temple walls. As the eclipse reached its peak, I placed the medallion in a small hole near the ring. The whole temple started shaking. The sand creatures rushed toward me, but they couldn't get close. The medallion was holding them back. Then I heard voices, hundreds of them, coming from the ring. I saw faces in the sand, all the people who'd been taken over the years. They were trapped between time, and they were trying to break free. The medallion started glowing brighter and brighter. I felt a pull, like something was trying to take my life force too. But instead of fighting it, I remembered my grandmother's words. Sometimes, to save others, you must give a piece of yourself. I placed my hand on the medallion and felt years of my life draining away. My hair turned gray in seconds, and I felt myself aging. But as this happened, something amazing occurred. The trapped souls in the sand began to take shape. They weren't just faces anymore. They were becoming real again. The ring started crackling with energy. The sand creatures howled, a sound I'll never forget, and began breaking apart. The machine was resetting itself, using my life force to free the others instead of trapping them. There was a flash of light so bright I had to close my eyes. When I opened them, the temple was quiet. The ring had stopped glowing. The sand creatures were gone. And around me, dozens of people lay on the ground, everyone who had disappeared in the past few days. They were alive but confused, with no memory of what had happened. The blood moon faded, and the sun rose on a changed Death Valley. The military came, of course. They tried to cover it up, saying it was a mass hallucination caused by desert heat. But they couldn't explain why I now looked 20 years older, or why that 30-square-mile area of desert had changed completely. These days, I am still a ranger here. My hair is white now, and I walk with a limp, gifts from that night. The temple is sealed off, buried under tons of sand. But sometimes, when the moon is full, I see strange lights in the distance, and every now and then, tourists report seeing an old man walking across the dunes who disappears when they get closer. They call him the Desert Ghost. I guess that's what I am now, part man, part legend, forever bound to watch over this place. Because I know the truth, the machine is just sleeping. In 30 years, when the blood moon rises again, someone else will have to be ready. But that's another story for another time. You might be wondering what happened after all this. Well, Death Valley is different now. The government built a secret research station nearby, disguised as a weather monitoring facility. They're always watching, always measuring, trying to understand what happened. The Hopi elders come every month to leave offerings at the edge of the changed zone. They say prayers in their ancient language, honoring the spirits and keeping the old promises. They know, like I do, that some things are better left sleeping. As for me, I am still here, doing my ranger duties. Sure, my body aged that night, but I gained something too. I can sense when things aren't right in the valley. Sometimes I feel the sand shift beneath my feet in ways it shouldn't, or I see time ripple like water in certain spots. The missing scientists we rescued that night, they're all living normal lives now. Doctors say their memories might never come back, and maybe that's for the best. But they all share the same strange dream sometimes, of dancing lights in the desert and faces in the sand. Tourists still come to Death Valley, taking pictures and enjoying the views. Most of them don't notice anything unusual. But every now and then, someone will see something. A pattern in the sand, a figure that disappears, or a patch of desert where their watches stop working. When they report these things to me, I just smile and tell them it's probably the heat playing tricks on their eyes. But I always make a note in my special logbook, tracking the signs. because 2005 isn't far away. That's when the next blood moon cycle begins. So if you are ever in Death Valley and you see an old ranger with white hair watching the dunes, that's probably me. Feel free to stop and say hello. Just don't ask me about the blood moon unless you are ready for the real truth. Because some stories aren't just stories, some are warnings. My name is David Thompson, but everyone in the Olympic National Park calls me Scout. This unbelievable story happened to me in 1958, when I was 49 years old, working as a park ranger. Before this job, I served in World War II as an intelligence officer, and those skills would soon prove more valuable than I could have ever imagined. It all started on a chilly October morning. I was drinking my usual black coffee in my cabin when I got an urgent call about a missing logging crew. 12 men, all experienced loggers, had vanished without a trace from the oldest part of the forest. What made it stranger was that they'd left behind all their equipment, their lunchboxes still full of untouched food, and their trucks with keys still in the ignition. I've spent most of my life in these woods, tracking everything from lost hikers to wounded animals. But something felt different this time. The morning I headed out to investigate, there was an unusual silence in the forest. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, nothing. Just an eerie quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Little did I know that this would be the beginning of 10 days that would change my life forever and make me question everything I thought I knew about nature, science, and reality itself. What I saw in those woods, well, I am still not sure if anyone will believe me, but I need to tell this story. I need others to know what's really out there, hiding in the green depths of the Olympic forest. As I drove my ranger truck down the muddy forest road that morning, I noticed something odd. The trees seemed different. Their leaves were a darker shade of green than usual, and some had grown strangely twisted. I'd been working in these woods for 15 years, but I'd never seen anything like this. When I reached the logging camp, my stomach turned. Everything was exactly as reported, abandoned in a hurry. 12 coffee cups sat on a wooden table, some still half full but now ice cold. Chainsaws lay scattered on the ground, covered in an unusual green-colored fungus I'd never seen before. It seemed to pulse slightly, like it was, breathing. I found their logbook in the site office. The last few entries made my blood run cold. The 12th of October. Something weird with the trees. They seemed to be growing back overnight where we cut them. The 13th of October. Jim says he saw the mist move again and says it followed him. The 14th of October. The forest feels wrong. The mushrooms are everywhere now. Charlie swears he heard the trees whispering. The 15th of October. Final entry. Get out, get out, get out. As I read the last entry, a gust of wind rustled through the camp. That's when I noticed it, a thin green mist creeping along the ground between the trees. It wasn't normal fog. It moved like it had a purpose, like it was searching for something. I grabbed the logbook and hurried back to my truck. Just as I was about to leave, I heard something that made me freeze. A sound like wood creaking, but it seemed to form words. Stay, Scout, stay. The rational part of my mind said it was just the wind in the trees. But after 20 years of military service and 15 as a ranger, I'd learned to trust my instincts. And every instinct I had was screaming that something was terribly wrong in these woods. I radioed back to headquarters. This is Scout. We're going to need help out here. A lot of help. As I drove back, I kept checking my rearview mirror. The green mist seemed to follow my truck, always staying just at the edge of visibility. I had a feeling this was just the beginning of something much bigger and much worse than a simple missing persons case. That night, I couldn't sleep. The logbook entries kept playing in my mind, and outside my cabin window, the strange mushrooms had appeared, glowing faintly in the darkness. Something had awakened in the ancient forest, and I had a terrible feeling it was watching us all. The next morning, I went back to the logging camp with two other rangers, Mike and Steve. We needed to look for any signs of the missing men. The green mist was thicker now, swirling around our ankles as we walked. "Look at this," Mike called out, pointing to some trees. What we saw made no sense. Trees that had been cut down yesterday had somehow grown back, but they were different, twisted and dark, with bark that looked almost like skin. That's when we found Tom, one of the missing loggers. I wish we hadn't. He was connected to a tree, like he had become part of it. His body was covered in that strange fungus, and his eyes were open but completely green. When we got closer, I swear I saw his fingers twitch. "Don't touch anything," I shouted, but it was too late. Steve had reached out to check Tom's pulse. The moment his hand touched Tom's arm, the fungus jumped onto his skin like it was alive. Steve screamed and tried to wipe it off, but it spread faster than he could brush it away. The green mist suddenly got thicker around us, and we could hear a deep humming sound coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Run!" I yelled. We sprinted back to our vehicles, but Steve was slowing down. The fungus had spread up his arm and across his chest. It's in my head, Scout," he gasped. "I can hear them. The trees. They're talking." We got Steve into my truck, but by the time we reached the ranger station, he was barely conscious. His skin had taken on a greenish tint, and small mushrooms were starting to grow from his shoulders. The military quarantine team arrived that afternoon. They put Steve in isolation, but I could tell by their faces they'd never seen anything like this. As they set up their equipment, I noticed something disturbing. The same green fungus was starting to grow on their metal containers. That evening, I sat in my cabin looking at old maps of the area. There had to be a reason this was happening. That's when I found something interesting. The logging camp was built right on top of what the local tribes used to call the Green Heart, a place their legends said should never be disturbed. Through my window, I could see the green mist getting thicker in the valley below. And in the distance, I heard trees moving, not swaying in the wind, but actually walking, their roots pulling free from the earth. I knew then that we weren't dealing with some simple forest disease. This was something ancient, something that had been sleeping until we woke it up, and now it was spreading. The radio crackled with static, and through the noise, I heard Steve's voice. "Scout, come back, the forest. It wants to show us something." I turned off the radio, but I could still hear whispers, coming from the mushrooms that had started growing in the corners of my cabin. Day 4 was when everything got worse. The military had set up a base camp, but their presence seemed to make the forest angry. The green mist was now so thick in some areas that you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I decided to hike to a place the local tribes had told me about, an old stone circle deep in the woods. Maybe there I could find answers about what we were dealing with. As I walked, I noticed all the animals were moving in the same direction, like they were running away from something. About 2 miles in, I found an old research station I'd never seen before. It was hidden behind thick vines, but the door was partly open. Inside, everything was covered in dust, except for one desk with a folder marked Project Green Wisdom, 1932. The papers inside told a horrible story. Back in the 30s, the government had found something in these woods, some kind of ancient life form that lived in the trees and fungus. They tried to study it, to control it, but something went wrong. The last report just said, "It's awake. God help us all." Suddenly, my radio burst to life. Through the static, I heard Mike's voice. "Scout, the trees, they're moving. The infected people. They're all walking towards the old burial ground. Steve is leading them." I ran outside, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. The green mist had taken shape. It looked like a giant hand made of fog and tiny glowing spores. It reached out towards me, and in my head, I heard a voice as old as the forest itself. "You understand us, Scout. You respect the old ways. Watch what happens when humans forget." The ground shook. In the distance, I saw massive shapes moving, ancient trees walking on their roots, heading towards the military camp. The screech of twisting metal and panicked shouting echoed through the valley. I started running back, but the forest itself seemed to be changing around me. Paths I'd known for years led to different places. Vines grew so fast I could actually see them moving. The mushrooms pulsed with light, seeming to point the way, but to where? When I finally got back to the base camp, it was chaos. The green mist had infected most of the soldiers. Those who weren't infected were evacuating in helicopters. Through the chaos, I saw Steve and the other infected people walking into the forest, their skin now bark-like, mushrooms growing from their shoulders. That night, watching from my cabin, I saw green lights dancing in the forest. The mist had spread to cover most of the valley. On my wall, the mushrooms had grown to spell out words, "Tomorrow we show you the truth." I loaded my backpack with supplies, knowing that, in the morning, I'd have to go back into those woods. Something told me I was the only one who could stop this, or maybe the only one who could understand what the forest really wanted. The question was, would I survive long enough to find out? When dawn came, I knew I had to go back into the forest. The green mist had spread everywhere now, and the only clear path was the one the infected people had taken, towards the old burial ground. As I walked, I noticed my compass spinning wildly. Time felt strange too. The sun seemed to stay in one place, like morning was lasting forever. The forest had never felt so alive, so aware. Every tree, every mushroom, every leaf seemed to be watching me. Then I found it. A massive underground cave entrance, glowing with green light. Inside, the walls were covered with the living fungus, pulsing like a giant heart. And there, in the center, stood Steve and the other infected people. They were part of the trees now, their bodies merged with the ancient wood. But they were alive, and they were smiling. "Welcome, Scout," Steve said. But his voice wasn't his anymore. It was deeper, older, like the voice of the forest itself. "Now you'll understand why this had to happen." The fungus showed me visions, like movies playing in my head. I saw the truth. Long ago, the forest was a living guardian, protecting Earth from things we couldn't understand. But humans had forgotten, had started destroying everything. The forest had awakened to restore balance. "We don't want to hurt people," the voice said through Steve. "We want to remind them, to reconnect them. But some must become part of us to save the rest." I felt the fungus trying to reach me, its spores landing on my skin. But instead of fear, I felt understanding. The forest wasn't evil. It was ancient and powerful. And it needed someone who could speak for it, someone who could be a bridge between two worlds. "You must choose, Scout," the voice said. "Join us fully like the others, or become our messenger. But decide quickly. The military will return with fire and poison. Only you can stop more violence." I looked at Steve and the others. They weren't in pain. They had become something new, something between human and nature. But I knew I could do more good staying mostly human, helping people understand what the forest really was. "I'll be your messenger," I said. "But you have to promise, no more taking people against their will." The fungus touched my hand, and I felt its power flow into me. Not enough to change me completely, but enough to understand, to communicate with it. The forest had chosen me, and I had chosen it. That's when I heard the helicopters coming. The military was returning, this time with flamethrowers and chemicals. I knew what I had to do. I walked out of the cave, my hands glowing slightly green, and faced the arriving soldiers. "Stop," I said, and the forest rose up behind me, not threatening, but protective. "There's something you need to understand." The military commanders weren't happy, but they listened. Maybe it was the way the trees swayed without wind, or how the green mist formed shapes that looked almost human. Or maybe it was because my eyes now had flecks of green in them, showing I was something between human and forest. I explained everything, the ancient guardian, the forest's purpose, and how fighting it would only make things worse. "The forest doesn't want war," I told them. It wants balance. Leave this section of the park untouched, and everything will stay peaceful. After hours of discussion, we reached an agreement. The military would quarantine this part of the forest, marking it as a restricted nature preserve. No logging, no building, no tourists. Just me, acting as a ranger and guardian, making sure nobody disturbed the ancient powers sleeping beneath the trees. That was 67 years ago. I am still here, still watching over the forest. The green mist kept me alive, though I am not fully human anymore. Every full moon, I visit Steve and the others in their underground city of glowing fungi and living wood. They're happy there, part of something bigger than themselves. Sometimes, late at night, hikers who've strayed too far report seeing an old ranger with green-flecked eyes, warning them to turn back. The local tribes bring offerings to the edge of the restricted zone, remembering the old ways. And the forest? It's still growing, still watching, but keeping its promise to never take anyone unwilling. The logbook from that first day sits on my shelf, its pages now sprouting tiny, glowing mushrooms. Next to it is my daily journal, where I write about the changes I see. The military still monitors the area from a distance, and sometimes they send young scientists to study the border of the green zone. I teach them what I can, what the forest allows me to share. But the real secret, the deep truth about what lives in these woods, stays between me and the ancient guardian. Some mysteries need to remain mysteries, and some powers are better left undisturbed. If you ever find yourself in the Olympic National Park and see a strange green mist between the trees, turn back. Or if you hear an old ranger's voice warning you away, listen to it. But know this, the forest isn't evil. It's just very, very old and very wise. And sometimes wisdom looks a lot like magic to those who don't understand. As for me, I am still Scout Thompson, still walking these woods. Part ranger, part guardian, part legend. And every day, I thank whatever fate brought me here, to become the bridge between two worlds, the keeper of the green mist's secrets. My name is Lisa Runningwolf, and this happened to me back in 1995, when I was working as an air rescue specialist at the Grand Canyon National Park. I was 38 then, and after serving years as an Air Force pilot, I thought I'd seen everything. But boy, was I wrong. I remember that day like it was yesterday. The summer sky was different, not the usual bright Arizona blue I'd grown used to. Dark clouds had been gathering for days, which was strange because our weather reports showed no signs of rain. As I sat in my office overlooking the massive canyon, something felt off. The air had this weird electricity to it, like right before a huge storm, but 10 times stronger. I was sipping my morning coffee when the first call came in. Jack, one of our tour helicopter pilots, was reporting strange instrument failures. "Lisa," he said, his voice shaking, "my compass is going crazy, and these clouds, they're not normal. I've never seen anything like this in my 15 years of flying." Little did I know, this was just the beginning. What happened over the next 10 days would change not just my life, but everything we thought we knew about the skies above the Grand Canyon. Some nights, I still wake up hearing that strange thunder and seeing those massive shadows in the clouds. Let me tell you my story, a story about ancient prophecies, mysterious creatures, and a battle that no flight school could have ever prepared me for. It all started when tour helicopters began having problems. First, it was just weird static on the radio. Then, one morning, a helicopter completely vanished. Just disappeared into thin air with 6 tourists on board. That's when things got really scary. I was up in my rescue helicopter, searching for the missing tourists when I first saw them, huge shadows moving through the clouds. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. They looked like giant birds, bigger than any plane I'd ever seen. Their wings must have been at least 40 feet wide. The weather kept getting stranger too. Lightning would strike from clear skies, and our instruments would go crazy. My phone would show times from different days, and my compass needle just spun in circles. Something was very wrong up there. The strangest part? The ancient rock drawings in the canyon. You know, the ones made by Native Americans hundreds of years ago. They started glowing during storms. Being half Hopi myself, I knew these weren't just random pictures. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the Thunderbirds, ancient sky guardians who could control the weather. I always thought they were just stories to scare kids, but now, one evening, while flying back from a search, my helicopter's engines suddenly died. Complete silence. Then I saw it, a massive bird-like creature right outside my window. Its eyes were glowing like lightning, and the air around it crackled with electricity. As I sat there, frozen in my seat, I realized my grandmother's stories weren't just legends, they were warnings. That's when the military showed up. They said they were here to help, but I could tell they knew more than they were saying. They had old files from World War II showing similar sightings. Whatever these creatures were, they'd been here before. Things got worse quickly. The Thunderbirds, that's what we started calling them, began appearing more often. They weren't just flying around anymore. They were hunting. A military jet that came too close was found 50 miles away, its pilots looking 20 years older than they should have. It was like these creatures could mess with time itself. One night, during a particularly bad storm, I discovered something incredible. My helicopter's emergency landing led me to a hidden cave entrance. Inside, I found an ancient temple, unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls were covered with drawings of the Thunderbirds, but these weren't just art, they were instructions. The Hopi elders came to help us understand. They explained that every 1,000 years, these creatures return through a special gateway between worlds. The temple was built to either welcome them or send them back, depending on their intentions. According to the elders, we were right in the middle of that 1,000-year mark. The storms got bigger every day. Sometimes, when lightning struck, people would see glimpses of different times, past and future mixed together. The military tried fighting the Thunderbirds with their fancy jets and weapons, but it was useless. You can't shoot down a creature that can disappear into clouds and control lightning. I spent nights studying the temple drawings with the elders. They showed me that the Thunderbirds weren't just monsters. They were guardians of some kind of balance between our world and theirs. But something had changed this time. They were angry, defensive, like something had disturbed their ancient patterns. The military wanted to bomb the whole area, but I knew that would only make things worse. The answer wasn't in their weapons, it was in those temple walls, in my grandmother's stories, and in the skies above the canyon. I just had to figure it out before it was too late. That's when I realized why all this felt so familiar to me. My grandmother used to say our family had the sky in our blood. Maybe that's why I became a pilot. Maybe that's why I was here, right now, when all this was happening. On the 10th day, everything came to a head. The biggest storm I'd ever seen was building over the canyon. The Thunderbirds were circling above the temple, their massive wings creating wind patterns that no weather radar could explain. The military was preparing for one final attack, but I knew in my gut that would be a disaster. I made a decision right then. Despite everyone yelling at me not to do it, I jumped into my helicopter. The temple drawings had shown something important. The Thunderbirds weren't here to hurt us. They were looking for someone, a new guardian, someone who could understand both worlds. As I flew up into the storm, my helicopter's instruments went completely dead. Lightning flashed all around me, but strangely, I wasn't scared anymore. The biggest Thunderbird, with eyes like blue fire, flew right beside me. In that moment, I understood what my grandmother meant about having the sky in our blood. The creature led me to the center of the storm. Below, I could see the temple glowing with a bright blue light. The military planes were approaching fast, but before they could reach us, something incredible happened. A bolt of lightning hit my helicopter, but instead of crashing, I felt myself changing. The next part is hard to explain. It was like becoming part of the sky itself. My helicopter dissolved around me, but I wasn't falling. I was flying, really flying, alongside the Thunderbirds. All the knowledge of their ancient purpose filled my mind. They weren't invaders. They were protectors of the balance between earth and sky, and they needed a new guardian who understood the human world. That guardian was meant to be me. When the storm cleared, my helicopter was found empty. The military searched for days, but they never found my body. The Thunderbirds disappeared too, but the strange weather patterns never completely stopped. Sometimes, during big storms, people say they see a strange shape flying through the clouds. Not quite a bird, not quite human. That was 10 years ago. The Grand Canyon is different now. There are new rules about where planes can fly, and strange storms still appear out of nowhere. The military keeps a small base nearby, watching the skies, but they never talk about what happened. The Hopi elders say I didn't disappear, I transformed. They're right. You see, I am still here, watching over the canyon, but in a different way now. During big storms, I soar with my new family, the Thunderbirds, protecting the delicate balance between our worlds. Some pilots swear they've seen me, a human-like figure riding the storm clouds, but of course, the official reports call these sightings weather miracles or mass hallucinations. My old rescue helicopter sits in a museum now, with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Lisa Running Wolf, lost in service. But I am not lost. I am exactly where I need to be." Sometimes, on stormy nights, I visit my grandmother's grave. The flowers I leave there puzzle the locals. They're always slightly warm, as if recently touched by lightning. To this day, tourists at the Grand Canyon sometimes hear strange thunder on clear days. The Hopi children point to the sky and whisper about the Thunderbird woman. And if you are ever flying over the canyon during a storm, and your instruments start acting weird, don't be afraid. That's just me, doing my job, keeping watch over both worlds. After all, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to be protected. And that's exactly what I do now, soaring between clouds and canyons, between past and present, between earth and sky. The story of the Thunderbirds isn't over, it's just entered a new chapter. And if you ever hear thunder on a clear day over the Grand Canyon, look up. You might just catch a glimpse of me still protecting the skies, just in a different uniform now. Hey, you know what's funny? People often ask me if I miss my old life. The truth is, my new life is more amazing than anything I could have imagined. But there are still some things people don't know about what happened during those 10 days at the canyon. Like how the Thunderbirds aren't just creatures, they're more like guardians of time itself. Those tourists who went missing in the helicopter. We found them 3 days later, not even realizing they'd been gone for days. To them, it felt like just a few minutes had passed. Their watches showed different dates, and their cameras had pictures from different times, past and future, all mixed up. Sometimes, I fly down to check on my old office at the rescue station. My coffee mug is still there, exactly where I left it that last morning. The new rescue pilot, Mike, swears he sometimes hears my voice on the radio during storms, warning about weather changes before they happen. He's right. Old habits die hard, I guess. You might wonder if I ever regret my choice. But you know what? When I am soaring through a sunset storm, watching over both worlds, feeling the energy of ancient skies flowing through me, I know I made the right decision. The Thunderbirds chose me because they needed someone who understood both worlds, the ancient and the modern, the ground and the sky. Here is a secret I haven't told anyone. On really quiet nights, when the moon is full and the canyon is peaceful, I can still take human form for a short while. I've used these moments to leave notes for the Hopi elders, helping them protect our sacred places. And sometimes, just sometimes, I sit at the edge of the canyon, feeling the wind on my skin, remembering what it was like to be just Lisa Running Wolf, the rescue pilot. But then the sky calls, and I answer, because that's who I am now, part human, part Thunderbird, all guardian. And you know what? I wouldn't have it any other way. Remember, next time you are at the Grand Canyon and see a storm coming, wave at the clouds. You never know, I might just wave back. Last week, something special happened. A young Hopi girl was lost in the canyon during a sudden storm. Her parents were terrified, but I knew exactly where to find her. I guided her to safety using gentle winds and glowing clouds to light her path. When she got home, she told everyone about the glowing lady in the storm who helped her. The military still keeps their files about me labeled classified, but they know I am here. Every now and then, when their planes get too close to the sacred areas, I send them a friendly reminder, just a small lightning show to guide them back on course. They've learned to respect these boundaries. My old friend Jack, the tour helicopter pilot, still flies tourists around the canyon. He tells them stories about the mysterious Thunderbird woman who protects the skies. Most people think it's just a tale to entertain tourists, but Jack knows better. Every time he flies, he tips his hat to the clouds, our little secret greeting. The canyon has changed since I've been watching over it. The air feels cleaner, the storms more purposeful, and the ancient places more protected. Even the animals sense it. Eagles fly higher, dancing with the wind patterns I create. It's like the whole canyon is more alive, more aware. Sometimes, when new pilots report strange weather patterns or glowing clouds, the control tower just smiles and says, "That's just Lisa keeping us safe." They're right. I am still doing my job as a rescue specialist, just in a very different way now. So if you ever visit the Grand Canyon and feel a warm breeze on a cold day, or see lightning dance in a clear sky, just smile. That's me, saying hello. After all, every good story has some magic in it, doesn't it? And this one? Well, it's still being written, one storm at a time.